I never imagined my perfectly manicured lawn would become the battlefield in a suburban war. But when Brenda Wilkins from the Pinecrest Estates, HOA, started using my front yard as her personal shortcut, everything changed. The first tire tracks appeared on a Tuesday morning in April, cutting a diagonal path across my pride and joy, a lawn I'd spent 3 years perfecting. My name is Adam Patterson, and until 6 months ago, I was just another homeowner in Pinecrest Estates, a quiet subdivision in Roswell, Georgia, about 30 minutes north of Atlanta. I'd moved here after my divorce, drawn by the well-maintained neighborhood and the promise of peace and quiet. The HOA fees were steep, but the community looked immaculate, trimmed hedges, matching mailboxes, and not a basketball hoop or bright-colored door in sight. I'd spent thousands on professional landscaping for my lawn. Premium Bermuda grass, an irrigation system, and weekly maintenance had transformed my yard into what my neighbor Tom called the emerald carpet. I took pride in it, especially after the mess that was my marriage to Melissa. The lawn became my therapy, something I could control when everything else felt chaotic. Then came Brenda Wilkins, the newly elected HOA president and self-appointed neighborhood dictator. I first met her at the annual community picnic, where she introduced herself by handing me a violation notice for my garbage can being visible from the street on trash day. "Rules are rules, Mr. Patterson," she said, her blonde bob haircut bouncing as she nodded emphatically. "We have standards to maintain." I'd smiled tightly and tucked the notice into my pocket. "I'll take care of it." That should have been the end of our interaction, but Brenda lived 3 houses down across the street, and for some reason, she'd decided that cutting across my front yard was an acceptable shortcut to her friend Margaret's house next door to me. The first time I saw her do it, I was working from home and happened to glance out my office window. Brenda's white Lexus SUV slowly rolled off the street, across my curb, and directly over my lawn, leaving twin depressions in the grass before pulling into Margaret's driveway. I blinked in disbelief. Did that really just happen? 2 days later, it happened again. This time, I rushed outside. "Excuse me," I called as she was getting out of her car. "Did you just drive across my lawn?" Brenda turned, her face a mask of practiced innocence. "Oh, Adam. It's just a little shortcut. The grass will bounce back." She waved dismissively and continued toward Margaret's front door. "Please don't do that again," I said firmly. "I spend a lot of time and money on my landscaping." She gave me a look that seemed to say, "Don't be difficult," and disappeared into Margaret's house. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next week, I caught her doing it again. This time, when I confronted her, her tone changed. "You know, Adam, I've been meaning to talk to you about your lawn anyway. The HOA board feels it's a bit too ostentatious for neighborhood standards. We're considering implementing a new bylaw about excessive lawn maintenance." My jaw dropped. "Excessive lawn maintenance? Are you kidding me?" "We've had complaints," she said vaguely. "From who?" I demanded. "That's confidential HOA business," she replied with a smirk. "But I'm sure we can work something out if you're flexible about certain things." The implication was clear. Let her use my lawn as her personal driveway or face the wrath of the HOA. I retreated to regroup and think. That night, I called my friend Ryan, who worked as a civil engineer. "She's doing what?" he asked after I explained the situation. "Driving across my front lawn like it's a road, and then threatening me with HOA violations when I call her out on it." "That's trespassing," Ryan said, "and probably vandalism too, since she's damaging your property." "Yeah, but she's the HOA president." "You know how these neighborhood tyrants operate." Ryan went quiet for a moment. "You know what would stop her? Boulders." "Boulders?" "Landscape boulders. They look decorative, but they'll definitely stop a car. I did it at my mom's place when neighbors kept cutting through her corner lot." Worked like a charm. The idea took root immediately. I spent the next day researching landscape boulders online, finding a local supplier in Alpharetta who had a good selection. I settled on 3 Georgia granite boulders, each about 24 inches high and wide enough to be unmistakable, but not so large as to be obnoxious. The following Saturday, the delivery truck arrived. The driver helped position the boulders strategically along the edge of my property where Brenda typically cut through. They looked natural and decorative. I even planted some ornamental grasses around their bases, but they formed an effective vehicle barrier. "Those are nice," my next-door neighbor Tom said, wandering over as I finished planting. "Adds character to the yard." "Thanks," I replied, wiping sweat from my brow, "just trying to protect my investment." Tom nodded knowingly. "I saw Brenda driving through here the other day. Couldn't believe my eyes." "Well, hopefully that stops now," I said. I didn't have to wait long to find out if my boulder strategy would work. The very next day, a Sunday afternoon, I was in my kitchen preparing lunch when I heard the unmistakable sound of metal meeting stone, followed by the blare of a car horn. Rushing to my window, I saw exactly what I'd both feared and secretly anticipated. Brenda's white Lexus had attempted her usual shortcut and collided with one of my boulders. The front bumper was visibly damaged, and Brenda was emerging from the driver's side, her face flushed with anger. I grabbed my phone and headed outside. This confrontation needed documentation. "What the hell is this?" she screamed as I approached, gesturing wildly at the boulder. "You put these here on purpose." I made sure my phone was recording. "Good afternoon, Brenda." "Yes, I installed landscape features on my property, as is my right. You did this to deliberately damage my car." Her voice had reached a pitch that had neighbors peering out their windows. "I installed decorative boulders on my property," I repeated calmly. "You drove your car onto my private property without permission and hit one of them. That's unfortunate, but it's not my responsibility." Brenda's face contorted with rage. "I'm calling the police." "That's probably a good idea," I agreed. "They can document the trespassing." This seemed to give her pause. Her eyes narrowed as she reassessed the situation. "The HOA will hear about this," she threatened. "Those boulders aren't approved landscaping features." "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone, "I checked the HOA guidelines thoroughly. Section 7.3 specifically allows for natural stone landscape elements under 36 inches in height. These qualify." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Finally, she stormed back to her car, maneuvered awkwardly back onto the street, and drove away, her damaged bumper making a scraping sound. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the matter was resolved. But my battle with Brenda and the Pinecrest Estates HOA was just beginning. 2 days later, an official-looking letter appeared in my mailbox. The Pinecrest Estates Homeowners Association was calling an emergency meeting to discuss dangerous landscaping elements at 1422 Pinecrest Drive, my address. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. I called Ryan immediately. "They're coming after my boulders," I explained. "Emergency HOA meeting and everything." "Typical," Ryan said, "but you're in the clear if they're within the guidelines you mentioned." "I am, but I'm betting Brenda conveniently revises the guidelines before Tuesday." Ryan chuckled. "Document everything. Take photos of your current HOA handbook, save emails, record conversations if Georgia law permits it. Georgia is one-party consent, so I can record any conversation I'm part of," I confirmed, having already looked this up. "Perfect. And get neighbors on your side. Brenda's probably pissed off plenty of people before you." He was right about that. I spent the weekend knocking on doors and discovered that Brenda had been terrorizing the neighborhood for months. Tom had been fined for leaving his garden hose uncoiled. Elderly Mrs. Chen had received violations for wind chimes. The Jacksons had been threatened with legal action over their son's treehouse, which had existed for years before Brenda took office. By Tuesday evening, I had a small coalition of homeowners ready to back me up. I also had printed copies of the HOA guidelines, time-stamped photos of Brenda driving on my lawn, and a consultation with a real estate attorney who assured me I was within my rights. The community center was packed when I arrived. Brenda sat at the front table with the other 4 board members, looking smugly confident. She'd changed the format from a normal meeting to what she called a violation hearing, essentially putting me on trial. "We're here to address the dangerous hazards installed by Adam Patterson at 1422 Pinecrest Drive," she began without preamble. "These unauthorized stone structures pose a significant risk to community safety and violate multiple HOA bylaws." I raised my hand. "Point of order." "Which specific bylaws are being cited?" Brenda shuffled some papers. "Section 12.1. No homeowner shall install any structure or element that poses a risk to vehicular or pedestrian traffic." "Those boulders are placed well within my property line," I countered. "They pose no risk to legal street or sidewalk traffic." "They damaged my vehicle," Brenda exclaimed, momentarily losing her composure. "When you drove onto my private property without permission," I replied evenly. "Which brings up an interesting question. Why were you driving on my lawn in the first place?" Murmurs rippled through the room. Brenda's face flushed. "That's not relevant to these proceedings." "I believe it is," I said, standing up. "I installed those boulders because Miss Wilkins repeatedly drove across my lawn as a shortcut, damaging my landscaping. I have video evidence." I connected my phone to the community center's projector and played a compilation of clips showing Brenda's Lexus cutting across my lawn on multiple occasions, followed by me politely asking her to stop, and her dismissive responses. The room grew tense. I could see several board members shifting uncomfortably. "Furthermore," I continued, "Section 7.3 of our HOA guidelines explicitly permits natural stone landscaping elements under 36 inches. My boulders comply with this requirement." I displayed the relevant section on the screen. Brenda sputtered. "That section was recently revised." "When?" I asked. "Because I have a copy of the guidelines dated 2 weeks ago, and the section reads exactly as I've shown." One of the other board members, a man named Harold who I'd always found reasonable, leaned over to whisper something to Brenda. She shook her head vigorously. "Miss Wilkins," Harold said, now speaking publicly, "did you attempt to retroactively change the landscaping guidelines after Mr. Patterson installed his boulders?" The room fell silent. Brenda's face turned an alarming shade of red. "That's absurd," she finally managed. "We've been planning to update those guidelines for months." Tom stood up from the back. "Then, why did you tell me last week that natural stone elements were perfectly acceptable when I asked about installing a rock garden?" Mrs. Chen raised her hand. "And why did you approve the Miller's stone fountain last month if these rules were changing?" The meeting was slipping out of Brenda's control. She banged a gavel I hadn't noticed before. "This hearing is about Patterson's dangerous boulders, not other landscaping issues." Harold cleared his throat. "Actually, Brenda, I think we need to table this discussion until we can clarify the timeline of any guideline revisions. If Mr. Patterson was in compliance with the rules when he installed the landscaping, we can't retroactively penalize him." Brenda looked like she might explode. "Fine," she snapped. "Meeting adjourned." She gathered her papers and stormed out. As people filed out of the community center, several neighbors patted my back or gave me thumbs up. Harold approached me. "Sorry about all this," he said quietly. "Brenda's been difficult since taking office. Some of us are considering calling for a special election to replace her." "I'd support that," I replied. I thought I'd won the battle, but Brenda wasn't finished with me yet. Over the next week, I received violation notices for everything from excessive lawn irrigation to unapproved mailbox color. It was the standard black that everyone had. Then things escalated. I came home from work one evening to find one of my boulders had been spray painted with the word hazard in bright orange. My security camera had caught Brenda in the act, wearing a hoodie that didn't remotely disguise her distinctive bob haircut. I called the police to file a vandalism report. The responding officer, a patient man named Sergeant Collins, reviewed my footage and took detailed notes. "This is technically criminal trespass and vandalism," he explained, "but it's a misdemeanor. I'll document it, but I recommend you try to resolve this through your HOA's internal dispute process first." "The problem is, she is the HOA," I explained. He nodded sympathetically. "I understand. Document everything, and if it continues or escalates, we'll take further action." I had the boulder professionally cleaned, which cost me $200, and installed additional security cameras covering every angle of my front yard. I also emailed the entire HOA board with the evidence of Brenda's vandalism, copying all homeowners whose email addresses I had. The response was swift. Harold called an emergency board meeting without Brenda's knowledge, where they voted to suspend her authority pending a full investigation. When Brenda found out, she was livid. The next morning, I was working from home when I heard a now familiar sound: tires on my lawn. Looking out the window, I saw Brenda's Lexus deliberately driving in circles on my grass, tearing up the turf and narrowly missing the boulders. I grabbed my phone and ran outside. "Brenda, stop this right now," I shouted. She rolled down her window. "This is what happens when you mess with me, Adam. You think you're so clever with your boulders and your rules. I am the rules in this neighborhood." Several neighbors had come out of their houses, witnessing her meltdown. Someone was filming. "I'm calling the police," I said, dialing 911. "Go ahead," she shouted, continuing to drive in circles. "By the time they get here, your precious lawn will be destroyed." Sergeant Collins arrived within minutes, along with another patrol car. By this time, Brenda had driven off my lawn and was parked in front of her house, pretending nothing had happened. Unfortunately for her, my security cameras had captured everything, as had several neighbors' cell phones. This time, Sergeant Collins wasn't as patient. He approached Brenda's house and had a long conversation with her on the porch, which ended with Brenda being issued a citation for criminal trespass, vandalism, and reckless driving on private property. The HOA board called another emergency meeting that evening. This time Harold presided and Brenda sat in the audience, arms crossed defiantly. "In light of recent events," Harold announced, "the board has voted to remove Brenda Wilkins from her position as HOA president, effective immediately. Her actions have violated both our community standards and state law." Applause broke out. Brenda stood up, face contorted with rage. "You can't do this. I've done nothing but try to maintain standards in this neighborhood. You'll all regret this when your property values plummet because people like him," she jabbed a finger at me, "are allowed to do whatever they want." "What Adam wanted was for you to stop driving on his lawn," Tom called out. "Seems reasonable to me." Brenda stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The next few weeks were quiet. Harold was appointed interim president and a special election was scheduled. My lawn recovered with some intensive care, and the boulders remained in place, now with flowers planted around them that made them look like they'd always been part of a cohesive landscape design. Then, one rainy night about a month after the meeting, I was awakened by a tremendous crash. Looking out my bedroom window, I couldn't see much through the downpour, but there appeared to be headlights pointing at an odd angle on my front lawn. I pulled on a robe and grabbed an umbrella, hurrying outside. There, halfway across my lawn, was Brenda's white Lexus, its front end crumpled around one of my boulders. The airbag had deployed and Brenda sat dazed behind the wheel. I called 911 immediately, reporting the accident. While waiting for emergency services, I approached the vehicle cautiously. "Brenda, are you hurt?" Despite everything, I was concerned. She looked at me through the window, her eyes unfocused. When she rolled down the window, the smell of alcohol was unmistakable. "You and your stupid rocks," she slurred. "This is all your fault." I stepped back as police and an ambulance arrived. Sergeant Collins was there again, looking decidedly unsurprised to be back at my address. "Mr. Patterson," he greeted me. "Looks like we meet again." I explained what had happened, and paramedics checked Brenda over. She wasn't seriously injured, but she was visibly intoxicated. After failing a field sobriety test, she was arrested for DUI, trespassing, and property damage. As they led her to the police car, she turned to me. "This isn't over, Adam. You've ruined everything." Sergeant Collins shook his head. "Actually, madam, I think it is over." He turned to me. "We'll need you to come down to the station tomorrow to give a full statement." The Lexus was towed away, leaving deep ruts in my lawn and damaging my irrigation system. My boulder, however, hadn't moved an inch. News of Brenda's arrest spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the next afternoon, when I returned from giving my statement at the police station, 3 of my neighbors had organized a lawn repair party. Tom brought his riding mower, the Jacksons brought sod to patch the damaged areas, and Mrs. Chen provided lunch for everyone. "We're just glad someone finally stood up to her," Mrs. Chen said, handing me a plate of homemade dumplings. "She's been making everyone miserable for too long." "I still can't believe she drove drunk into your yard," Tom said, shaking his head. "What was she thinking?" "I don't think she was," I replied. "She seemed fixated on destroying my lawn or my boulders or both." The special HOA election was held the following week. Harold was elected president, running on a platform of reasonable enforcement and neighbor respect. One of his first actions was to create an appeals process for HOA violations, requiring at least 3 board members to confirm any penalty. As for Brenda, she faced multiple charges. The DUI was her second offense, making it more serious. She was sentenced to community service, mandatory alcohol treatment, and 2 years of probation. She was also ordered to pay restitution for the damage to my lawn and irrigation system. The most unexpected twist came 3 months later when a "for sale" sign appeared in front of Brenda's house. I was working in my garden when a real estate agent led a young couple to view the property. As they walked past my house, I overheard the agent explaining the neighborhood. "Pinecrest Estates has an active but reasonable HOA," she was saying. "They maintain the common areas beautifully and the neighbors are very friendly. This house is priced below market because the seller is motivated for a quick sale." The woman in the couple noticed me and waved. "Your yard is gorgeous. Those boulders with the flowers are such a nice touch." I thanked her and introduced myself. When they mentioned they were considering buying Brenda's house, I briefly considered warning them about the neighborhood drama but decided against it. Brenda was leaving, and the HOA was under new leadership. The past was the past. 2 weeks later, Brenda's house sold. I saw her supervising the movers, looking deflated compared to her former imperious self. As I walked by with my dog, she glanced up and our eyes met briefly. I nodded politely. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded back, then turned away. That evening, Harold hosted a neighborhood barbecue in the community park. Standing on a picnic table with a glass of lemonade, he made a toast. "To new beginnings and good neighbors. May our property values stay high and our drama levels stay low." Everyone laughed and applauded. As I looked around at my neighbors, Tom flipping burgers, Mrs. Chen sharing her famous potato salad, the Jacksons' kids playing tag on the grass, I realized that the community I'd hoped for when moving to Pinecrest Estates was finally emerging. My phone buzzed with a text from Ryan. "How'd those boulders work out for you?" I smiled and typed back. "They're still standing. Can't say the same for the HOA Karen." The incident with Brenda and my boulders became neighborhood legend, referenced whenever new residents moved in or when someone suggested overly restrictive new rules. "Remember the boulder incident," someone would say, and knowing looks would be exchanged. 6 months after Brenda moved away, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. The return address was from a town in Tennessee. Inside was a brief note. "Adam, sorry about your lawn. The boulders were a good idea. BW." I tucked the note away, surprised but somewhat pleased by this small acknowledgement. People can change, I thought, even HOA Karens. A year passed. My lawn had fully recovered and the boulders had become a fixture, now surrounded by thriving perennial gardens. The HOA under Harold's leadership had become what it should have been all along, a resource for maintaining neighborhood standards without micromanaging people's lives. Then one Saturday morning, as I was having coffee on my front porch, a moving truck pulled up to the house across the street that had been vacant for a month. A woman with a sharp blonde bob stepped out, directing movers with military precision. My coffee mug paused halfway to my lips. It couldn't be, could it? But it wasn't Brenda. The new neighbor introduced herself as Catherine Wilson, recently divorced and looking for a fresh start. As we chatted, I found myself reflexively scanning her driveway for a white Lexus. Instead, she drove a sensible blue Subaru. "I love your landscaping," Catherine commented. "Especially those gorgeous boulders. I've been thinking about something similar for my yard." I smiled. "They're great for creating visual interest," I said, "and occasionally they serve other purposes too." Catherine looked puzzled, but I just laughed. "Welcome to Pinecrest Estates. We have an HOA meeting next Tuesday if you'd like to meet more neighbors. It's usually pretty uneventful these days." As Catherine headed back to oversee the movers, Tom wandered over from next door. "New neighbor seems nice," he observed. "Nothing like you-know-who." "Not at all," I agreed, though I did have a moment of panic when I saw that blonde bob. Tom chuckled. "I think we're all a little traumatized, but hey, at least your boulders are still standing guard." I looked at my 3 granite sentinels, now weathered and settled into the landscape as if they'd always been there. They'd cost me a few $100s, but had saved me countless headaches and eventually freed an entire neighborhood from a petty tyrant. "Best landscaping investment I ever made," I said. Over the next few years, other changes came to Pinecrest Estates. Harold moved to Florida to be closer to his grandchildren. The Jacksons' treehouse was finally approved with proper safety modifications. Mrs. Chen became the social committee chair and organized monthly multicultural potlucks that became the highlight of the neighborhood calendar. I remained on friendly terms with Catherine, who turned out to be an avid gardener. We often exchanged plants and advice, and she never once drove across my lawn. Occasionally, I'd get updates about Brenda from mutual acquaintances. She'd remarried and seemed happier in her new community, where she reportedly joined the garden club rather than the HOA board. 5 years after the Boulder incident, I decided to sell my house. My company was transferring me to their Seattle office, an opportunity too good to pass up. As I worked with my real estate agent to list the property, she suggested highlighting the professional landscaping and decorative boulder features in the description. "They really add character to the property," she explained. "Buyers love that kind of distinctive touch." I laughed to myself, thinking about how those boulders had come to be there. "They definitely have a story behind them," I told her. "Oh," she prompted. "Let's just say they've protected this lawn through some interesting times." On my last day in Pinecrest Estates, the neighbors threw me a goodbye party. Tom presented me with a small granite paperweight carved to look like one of my boulders. "So you never forget your stand against tyranny," he said with a wink. Mrs. Chen had tears in her eyes as she hugged me. "You changed this neighborhood for the better," she whispered. "We won't forget." As I packed the last boxes into my moving truck, I took a final walk around my yard. The new owners, a young family with 2 children, had already visited several times to take measurements and plan their move in. They'd asked if I would consider leaving the boulders as their kids loved climbing on them. "Of course," I'd said. "They belong here." Standing by the largest boulder, I patted its cool surface one last time. "Take care of them," I murmured, feeling only slightly foolish for talking to a rock. As I pulled out of the driveway for the last time, I noticed Catherine working in her garden across the street. She waved, and I honked in response. In my rearview mirror, I could see the boulders standing sentinel by the curb, framed by the blooming flowers around them. They'd started as a defensive measure against one difficult neighbor, but had become something more, a symbol of standing your ground. of finding creative solutions to problems, and ultimately, of building a community where people respected each other's boundaries. In Seattle, my new home had no HOA, which was a relief after my experiences in Pinecrest Estates. But occasionally, when new neighbors would comment on the lack of regulations, I'd tell them the story of the HOA Karen and the Boulders. Sometimes, I'd conclude, the best way to deal with people who won't respect your boundaries is to make those boundaries impossible to ignore. 2 years into my Seattle life, I received an unexpected email from Tom. Attached was a photo of my old house, the Boulders now surrounded by an elaborate children's garden the new owners had created. Fairy houses nestled between them, and painted pathways wound around their bases. "Thought you'd appreciate this," Tom wrote. "Your Boulders live on, serving a new purpose." Oh, and you'll never guess who moved back to the neighborhood last month. My heart skipped a beat. "Please tell me it's not Brenda," I replied. No, came Tom's quick response. "Harold's back. His daughter moved to Atlanta, so he returned to be near the grandkids." The HOA immediately elected him president again. All is well in Pinecrest Estates, thanks in no small part to your stand against lawn terrorism. Those Boulders should get a commemorative plaque. I laughed out loud in my Seattle kitchen, imagining a small bronze marker next to one of the granite boulders. Here stands the rock that stopped a Karen. That evening, as rain pattered against my windows, a common Seattle soundtrack, I found myself scrolling through old photos of my Pinecrest Estates home. There were shots of the lawn before Brenda's tire tracks, after the damage, the installation of the Boulders, and finally, the restored yard in all its glory. The last photo in the album was one I'd forgotten taking, a close-up of the boulder that Brenda had ultimately crashed into. In the image, spring flowers were blooming around its base, and morning light caught the granite's crystalline facets, making them sparkle. What had begun as a defensive barrier had transformed into something beautiful. I realized that my experience with Brenda and the HOA had changed me. Before moving to Pinecrest Estates, I'd been conflict avoidant, still reeling from my divorce and looking for peace at any cost. The Boulder incident had taught me that sometimes standing your ground wasn't just about protecting your property. It was about establishing healthy boundaries and refusing to be bullied. In my new Seattle neighborhood, I'd become known as the guy who organized the block's first community garden, who helped mediate a dispute between neighbors over a fence line, and who started a tool-sharing program that brought people together. The lessons from Pinecrest Estates had made me more engaged, more willing to build community rather than just exist within one. As I closed my laptop, I smiled at the thought of those 3 Boulders, still standing guard in a yard I no longer owned. They'd served their purpose for me, and now they were serving a new one for a different family. Boundaries, protection, beauty, the Boulders had come to represent all these things. My phone pinged with a text from my new neighbor in Seattle. "Block party planning committee tomorrow night." "Count me in," I replied. "And wait until you hear my suggestion for the community garden border. Sometimes the best solutions are rock solid."